Imagine walking into an Egyptian marketplace 3,000 years ago and realizing, within seconds, that everything here is in motion. Baskets pass from hand to hand, dried fish sway from hooks, fabrics are lifted against the light, and no one seems to waste a second. But there is one striking detail. You see no coins, no change, nothing that looks like the kind of trade we know today. So how did this system really work? And more than that, what kept so many people negotiating at the same time inside an dichotomy with no circulating money like ours? The Egyptian marketplace came alive before the sun fully took over the sky. In the dim early light, vendors arrived carrying baskets, jars, cloth, and dried fish, each one trying to claim a good spot before the crowd thickened. This was not some improvised scene. There was routine, experience, and a kind of order everyone understood. Porters moved through the narrow passageways, buyers watched from a distance, and the day's first deals were already beginning to take shape. It is a good question. How could a place this busy function without coins changing hands? It is right here, in these first hours of the morning, that the logic of this system begins to reveal itself. Now the market is fully awake. What looked like preparation just moments ago has turned into constant flow, people coming in, moving out, carrying, watching, bargaining without pause. The open space helps everything. Nothing is hidden, from the vendor displaying his goods to the buyer calculating what he can afford to take home. And this is what makes it so fascinating. The market was not just a place to buy things, it was one of the city's main centers of circulation. Goods, labor, information, and need all pass through here all day long. Once we see that movement up close, it becomes clear that Egyptian trade was not some side activity. It was part of the machinery that kept urban life running every single day. The closer we look, the more the market stops being just a crowd and starts revealing its inner logic. The most common goods appear everywhere. Fresh bread laid out on stalls, beer in jars, dried fish hanging in rows, vegetables stacked high, folded fabrics, lined up pottery, and tools moving from hand to hand. Nothing here is excess. Everything answers a real need. And that is what gives this scene its historical weight. The market shows everyday life without glamour. What people ate, wore, stored, and used to work passed through this space. And honestly, that is where history comes alive. By this point, the market no longer feels like just a place of buying and selling. It works as a meeting point, a place to watch, and even a kind of barometer for the city itself. People do not just grab whatever is in front of them, they look, weight, compare texture, weight, freshness, and usefulness. A trade begins long before the final agreement, and that says a lot about urban Egypt. Value was not only in the object itself, but also in the collective eye that recognized its quality. Small, negotiations appear constantly, almost without pause. It is social and economic at the same time, the kind of rhythm that makes a city breathe and organize itself right in front of us. Now the system becomes even more interesting because the market forces us to let go of the modern idea of buying with money in hand. In Egypt, many exchanges depended on practical equivalence. How much bread might equal fish, how much cloth could make up for oil, how one useful good measured against another. This was not chaos, and it was not improvised. It was everyday calculation built on habit, need, and direct comparison. At first glance, it may seem simple. It was not. Every object carried a value recognized by the people around it, and this is where Egyptian trade begins to show its real intelligence without needing coins to circulate the way ours do. As the market moves forward, one thing becomes clear. The value of a product was never fixed or automatic. The same loaf of bread could be worth more or less depending on size, quality, the urgency of the buyer, and even the amount available that day. That is where Egyptian trade becomes more sophisticated than it first appears. It was not just about swapping one thing for another, it was about adjusting expectations, usefulness, and quantity in real time. In other words, value was born through comparison, and that changes the way we imagine this market, because it reveals a system that was practical, flexible, and deeply aware of context. And here, Egyptian trade takes another step forward. What looks like simple barter starts to reveal a deeper logic of reference. People compared goods based on recognizable measures, visible quantities, and values that already lived in everyone's mind. No one was negotiating on pure guesswork. There was a shared sense of what was enough, what was fair, and what still needed to be made up. That matters because it changes the whole picture. The market did not run on total improvisation. It operated with standards, maybe not coins, fine, but something essential to any economy was already there. Stable comparison between different forms of value. This is where a lot of people are surprised, because Egypt was already working with something far more sophisticated than loose exchange. Certain goods could be understood in units of value, like the deben, used as a reference for weight and equivalence, even when no metal object actually changed hands. In other words, value could be calculated without money circulating as direct payment. That makes the whole scene much more advanced than it first seems. The market did not rely only on the eye of the buyer or the persistence of the seller. It also relied on accepted comparisons and measures that made exchanges more predictable. And yes, this is already starting to look a lot like real economics. Once we understand the logic of value, it is worth looking again at the vendors. They are the ones who keep the market moving, defending the quality of what they offer, adjusting quantities, and trying to close deals before the heat intensifies and the flow begins to shift. No one here is simply waiting for a buyer to fall from the sky. Every gesture matters, repositioning goods, highlighting the best batch, separating what holds more value, speeding up a deal when an opportunity appears, and there is pressure too, because the market's timing affects value. Before the sun turns harsh, the seller still has room to negotiate calmly. After that, urgency steps in and everything becomes more direct. Now the focus shifts fully to the buyer. Families calculate what they can afford to carry home. Workers prioritize the essentials of the day, and artisans look for materials that still make sense within what they have available to trade. No one acts on impulse. Everyone measures need against what they can offer, and that is where bargaining begins. The most interesting part is this. The market only works because buyer and seller both know how to read each other's sense of value. And now that we are at the heart of that logic, it is worth staying to the very end, because the next blocks reveal how Egypt turned custom into system. That is where things get really good. When we slow down and look more carefully, we realize the market was not sustained by good intentions alone. There were weights, measures, public observation, and a collective memory of what seemed fair and what clearly crossed the line. That is decisive. A vendor was not operating alone in the dark. His exchanges happened in full view inside customs that gave the whole process stability. In other words, trust was not some vague feeling, it was built through repetition, comparison, and social presence. And that makes the Egyptian market far more sophisticated than the simplified image of improvised barter that many people still imagine. By this stage, the scribes stopped being background figures and moved to the center of the explanation. They were not there just to write beautifully or record the great deeds of the state. Their presence helps explain how such an active system kept its coherence. Accounts, lists, measurements, deliveries, and written notes created administrative memory. And that is crucial. Without records, too many exchanges would depend only on memory or immediate reputation. With records, the market connects to something bigger, an Egypt that knew how to organize production, movement, and obligation. In short, trade was not just a social habit, it was part of a strong administrative culture, and that matters a great deal. But the market does not explain itself. For it to function every day, someone first had to plant, harvest, fish, produce, store, and transport long before any trade could happen. This is where the frame gets wider. Bread comes from fields and granaries. Fish comes from the Nile. Linen comes from workshops. Jars come from potters. And all of it depends on routes, laborers, and the rhythm of logistics. In other words, the market is the visible part of a much larger network. And that network reveals an important truth about Egypt. Urban economy could only exist because countryside, river, skilled labor, and administration were deeply connected to one another. Now the pace begins to tighten. The flow of goods increases, the corridors grow more crowded, and what once felt like routine starts to carry real tension. Exchanges rise in volume, batches grow larger, and so do the risks. A miscalculation weighs more heavily now, a delay costs opportunity. And a strong deal can vanish in seconds. This is where the market stops being merely observable and starts becoming contested. Everything is more visible, more exposed, more competitive, and that matters. Because the climax does not come from nowhere. It appears when quantity, pressure, and value collide in the same space at the same moment. Now the market reaches the peak of its movement. Goods change hands quickly. Agreements are sealed almost at the edge of time. And every open space seems worth its weight in gold, or rather, in equivalent value, because actual coin is still not part of the equation here. The scribes track the larger deals, watch the measurements, record what matters, and help give shape to this organized chaos. The most striking part is that nothing seems to stop. Everyone is competing for attention, opportunity, and margin at the same time. This is the point where the market shows its full power, not as some decorative scene from ancient Egypt, but as a living mechanism, tight, efficient, and under constant pressure. We arrive at the moment when everything narrows into one major negotiation. It is not just a bigger exchange than the others, it is a scene that sums up the entire market. On one side, a range of goods; on the other, calculation, comparison, time pressure, and the need to close something that makes sense for everyone involved. Without money circulating, the agreement depends on recognized equivalence, public trust, and a fine adjustment between usefulness and value. Look at how powerful that is. There is no pure improvisation here. What is at stake is visible proof that this system works because many people are sharing the same logic at the same time. The most important part is not the visual impact of the big exchange, but what happens immediately after it. The goods leave that moment and instantly gain new destinations: workshops, homes, storage spaces, and other hands across the city. That is what proves the system's efficiency. The market does not stall after the major negotiation. It keeps flowing, redistributing goods, and reorganizing needs. Instead of collapsing, it absorbs pressure and keeps functioning. And that says a great deal. About Egypt, the strength of trade was not only in the moment of agreement, but in the ability to turn exchange into continuous movement that remained useful in everyday life. After the central moment, the narrative steps back to reveal who truly sustained all of this. The market did not survive on skilled merchants or attentive scribes alone. It depended on fishermen bringing food from the river, farmers tied to the harvests, artisans turning raw material into useful goods, porters moving weight all day long, and workers paid in kind. That detail is essential. Egyptian trade worked because a great many people fed the system before, during, and after every exchange. In other words, the market was the visible meeting point of very different efforts, all connected by necessity, labor, and the constant movement of goods. When the focus turns to women and families, the market gains another layer. It stops looking like a purely public space of negotiation and begins to appear as a direct extension of domestic life. Women select food, evaluate cloth, manage containers, measure need, and take part in the circulation of goods in practical, constant ways. Entire families enter that logic, whether by bringing products in or reorganizing what was acquired during the day. That matters because it shows that Egyptian trade did not end at the stall. It continued inside homes, workshops, and family routines. Deep down, the market was also part of the social economy that sustained everyday life. At this point, the market can no longer be seen as an isolated space. It is connected to the machinery of the Egyptian state. Administration, collection, storage, and redistribution formed the base that sustained both supply and the authority of pharaonic power. That changes the reading of the scene in a major way. What looks like ordinary daily trade also expresses control, organization, and the ability to coordinate at scale. Granaries, records, officials, and the circulation of goods were all parts of the same system. In other words, the market was one visible piece of something larger, the administrative strength of Egypt, turning production into order and resources into political stability. But this system was not perfect, and that is where the story becomes even more interesting. The market depended on harvests, transport, available supply, and steady provisioning. When one of those pieces failed, the value of goods shifted, exchanges became more tense, and the room for negotiation narrowed. A shortage of grain, a smaller catch of fish, or delays in arriving goods could change the balance of the entire day. That matters because it reveals the fragility beneath the organization. Egypt was efficient, yes, but it was also dependent on natural cycles and constant logistics. In other words, order existed, but it was never immune to scarcity, imbalance, or everyday pressure. Even with failures, pressure, and moments of shortage, what emerges as a whole is still an impressively functional system. And that may be one of the strongest points in the entire video. Egypt was not just temples, stone, and monumentality. It was also management, supply, calculation, record-keeping, and practical adaptation. The market makes that clear. There were informal rules, recognized measures, transportation networks, and a real ability to keep urban life in motion. In other words, behind the grand image of empire, there was an everyday economy operating efficiently enough to sustain workers, workshops, homes, and administration. And that gives a whole new dimension to what we call Egyptian civilization. Now, the market begins to change rhythm. Movement still exists, but it starts to lose intensity. Stalls begin to empty, the corridors feel less crowded, and what remains on the tables begins telling another part of the story, the closing of a daily cycle of exchange. This moment matters because it shows that the market had a breathing pattern of its own. It expanded, pressed forward, distributed, and then slowed down. What remains are goods, final adjustments, and more selective decisions. This is no longer the rush of midday, it is almost a quiet reckoning of what moved, what stayed behind, and what may still circulate later on. The economy continues, but the pulse of the space is clearly beginning to drop. In the visual closing, the market stops being pressured and becomes routine, completing a cycle. Workers gather goods, vendors organize what is left, scribes close out their records, and every gesture suggests a natural continuation the next day. That detail is beautiful because it pulls Egypt out of the frozen image of a distant past and gives it back something deeply human: repetition, labor, and renewal. Nothing here feels final. It feels like part of a daily mechanism that will rebuild itself. At first light, the market closes, but the system remains ready to begin again. And it is precisely in that return to the everyday that the real functioning of Egyptian trade becomes most convincing. What this market reveals, in the end, goes far beyond the exchange of goods. It shows a society organized by custom, sustained by interdependence, and fully capable of recognizing value without relying on modern currency. Every seller, buyer, scribe, porter, and worker belonged to a shared logic. And maybe that is the strongest point of all. Trust here was not an abstraction. It was repeated practice, observed and recognized by everyone. Egyptian trade becomes a window into Egypt itself, not only as a monumental civilization, but as a living society, coordinated and economically coherent at the most everyday level of human experience. In the end, the great turning point of this Egyptian marketplace is both simple and powerful. It functioned without modern currency, but never without logic. There was recognized value, practical equivalence, record-keeping, administrative memory, and social trust built through custom that completely changes the shallow image of a primitive form of trade. What we see here is an efficient system adapted to Egyptian reality and fully capable of sustaining circulation, labor, and supply. And maybe that is the most surprising part of all. 3,000 years later, the tools have changed, but the structure still feels familiar. Deep down, economy has always been this organization, necessity, and shared value.